of land laws in Bangladesh. Ancient period. The earliest land laws of Bangladesh can be traced back to Aboriginal communities who treated land as common property of the clan. Families cultivated the land in their possession and paid a share of the produce to the clan head. The panchayat leader had the authority to distribute community land among families and settle disputes, forming the first organized land administration. With the rise of kingship, the basic land system remained largely unchanged. Cultivators continued to enjoy secure possession as long as they paid a share of their produce to the king. Classical texts such as Kautilya's Arthasastra and the Dharma Sutras emphasized that anyone who cleared jungle and made land cultivable gained the right to own it, subject to payment of land revenue. Rates varied from 1/6 to 1/3 of the produce, depending on irrigation and facilities provided. Village land gradually became common property shared among permanent residents. Hereditary cultivators could not be evicted if they paid revenue, and land transfers to outsiders required the consent of other settlers. Muslim period. When Bakhtiar Khalji conquered Bengal in the early 13th century, the basic land system continued, but the revenue rate increased to 1/5 or 1/4 of the produce. Tenants paying rent in cash could transfer land freely, but sharecropping tenants had no transfer rights, though their land remained heritable. Wastelands were granted as jagir or ima to officials and religious persons, and anyone who brought wasteland under cultivation became its owner upon paying revenue. As village headmen lost power, many became talukdars, who collected revenue for zamindars and received a share. Government caste land was leased on fixed revenue, usually cultivated by bagadars, who received half the produce but held no tenancy rights. During the Mughal period, the system became highly organized. Land revenue was generally assessed at 1/3 of the produce, calculated by officials like amins, kanungos, karkans, chowdhuries, and patwaris. Mughal authorities prohibited zamindars and other collectors from imposing abwab, illegal levies, or evicting cultivators. Zamindars were not landowners but hereditary revenue collectors, while ijaradar, jagirdars and imadars held non-hereditary grants. Later imadari became hereditary. The cultivators themselves were categorized based on their relationship with the village. 1. Khud caste rayats. These were permanent settlers who cultivated land in their own village. They paid a fixed revenue and were protected. They could not be evicted and held possession from generation to generation, though they were also restricted from abandoning the land freely. 2. Pai caste rayats. These were farmers who cultivated land in a village where they did not live. They operated on a contract basis and were considered tenants at will, having no guaranteed right to continued possession after the harvest, and could abandon the land at their own convenience. Bagadars and agricultural laborers cultivated zamindari caste lands but had no rights beyond receiving part of the produce or wages. British period. The British period in Bengal's land administration began after the 12th of August 1765, when the East India Company received the Diwani rights from the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam. This gave the company the authority to collect revenue from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. At first, the company maintained the traditional system of revenue collection, leaving the existing zamindars and ijaradars in place. However, the period of indirect control, known as the dual government, led to severe mismanagement and overassessment. This caused the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. The company soon changed the system by selling the right to collect revenue to the highest bidders through a series of temporary settlements. Quinquennial, 5-year, settlement, 1772 to 1777. Effect. This system failed spectacularly as speculative bidding by revenue farmers led to wildly high revenue targets, causing intense exploitation. widespread defaults, and a decline in agricultural productivity. Annual, 1-year, settlements, 1777, decennial, 10-year, settlement, 1790. Effect, this was the final decade-long step taken before permanence, meant to secure a more stable revenue amount based on past figures. It became the basis for the permanent settlement of 1793. A major transformation came with Lord Cornwallis's permanent settlement of the 22nd of March 1793. He declared that the decennial settlement would be made permanent, which meant that zamindars and talukdars became permanent, hereditary and transferable owners of the lands under their control. They were required to pay a fixed amount of revenue to the government. If they failed, their zamindari could be sold at auction. This turned government revenue agents into landowners overnight. At the same time, the permanent settlement placed no restrictions on landlords, increasing the rents of rayats. Their customary rights, such as paying rent at traditional Pargana rates, were denied despite Regulation Number 8 of 1793 directing landlords not to raise the rent of tenants who had paid fixed rent for over 12 years. Landlords' powers were further strengthened by Regulation Number 17 of 1793, which permitted them to attach and sell all movable property of defaulting rayats, including standing crops, without any intervention of the courts. Lakiraj, revenue-free. Lands were partly recognized under the Badshahi and non-Badshahi Lakiraj regulations of 1793, but most of these lands were later resumed or assessed to revenue. Lands outside the permanent settlement were treated as Khas Mahal, allowing the government to settle them directly. The rayats often resisted the increased rents and arbitrary attachments, forcing the government to pass Regulation Number 7 of 1799, which shockingly authorized landlords to arrest tenants who refused to pay rent and to attach and sell their property. This harsh measure was later softened by Regulation Number 5 of 1812, which removed the landlord's power to arrest rayats. During this period, the British also reformed the functions of village patwaris and Pargana kanungos, placing kanungos on salaries and granting patwaris rent-free land or allowances. Another major issue was the auction of zamindari rights. Originally, auction purchasers could evict even Kudkast, permanent, rayats, and lease out their lands at higher rents. To prevent this, Regulation Number 11 of 1822 prohibited the eviction of kaimi, permanent, rayats by auction purchasers, although other rayats could still be evicted for arrears. Several regulations, such as Regulation 14 of 1793 and Regulation 3 of 1794, dealt with arresting defaulting zamindars, appointing amins, and selling zamindaris to recover arrears. Later laws allowed zamindaris to be sold in parts. 1796 permitted the Board of Revenue to approve full sales. 1812, and empowered the board to set aside irregular sales. 1822. Finally, Act 12 of 1841, known as the Sunset Law, required revenue to be paid by sunset on the day before the auction date, otherwise the zamindari would be sold. Auction purchasers were also restricted from evicting certain permanent tenants or raising their rents. These rules were later consolidated and amended through Act No. 1 of 1845, the Revenue Sale Law. As the East India Company failed to protect tenant rights, the British government introduced reforms. The Rent Act of 1859, Act 10 of 1859, attempted to improve the condition of rayats by granting occupancy rights to anyone who possessed land continuously for 12 years. However, this did not apply to annual or thika tenants, and many landlords forced tenants into agreements that undermined their rights. Later, the Rent Act of 1862 allowed tenants to deposit rent with the collector if landlords refused payment, and the collector could impose compensation up to 25% on either party. This act also allowed landlords to measure and survey tenant lands. The Rent Act of 1869 largely restated earlier rules but recognized limited transfer rights of occupancy tenants and shifted landlord-tenant disputes to civil courts.